30s, the United States made do with British Mark 8 tanks from World War I. During World War II, only a few M6 heavies were built, and they never saw combat. World War III was going to be different. In the 1940s and 1950s, several nations fielded heavy tanks. The Soviets, whose T-34 medium tanks had also been chewed up by German heavies, had developed the 45-ton JS-3 and the 52-ton T-10, armed with massive 122mm guns. The British had the 64-ton Conqueror with a 120mm gun, and even the French had the AMX-50 heavy tank. The United States had fielded the 46-ton M-26 Pershing at the end of World War II as a heavy tank, but it was outmuscled by the competition. Prior to World War II, a tank weighing 30 tons or more was regarded as heavy, Honeycutt writes. But by the early post-war period, medium tanks had reached 45 to 50 tons and heavy tanks weighing over 70 tons were being considered. The US Army experimented after 1945 with various heavy tank designs. But spurred by growing Cold War tensions, the Army opted to push an untested design, the T-43 heavy tank armed with a 120mm gun, into production. In a story all too familiar in Pentagon arms procurement, the Army built 300 tanks before ejecting the vehicle because of defects such as problems with the turret and gun controls, gun sight and accuracy of the 120mm ammunition. This triggered congressional hearings. But the Army position was that the tank had been available for combat and that the modifications made were actually only refinements and improvements in design, according to author Robert Hicks. The solution was to modify the T-43 into a new vehicle called the M-103, the first operational American heavy tank since the Mark 8. The M-103 was a 62-ton vehicle with a crew of 5. It had a maximum speed of just 21 miles per hour, and even with a 268-gallon gas tank, it only had a range of 80 miles. It was armed with a 120mm M58 cannon alongside a .30 caliber coaxial machine gun, and a .50 caliber machine gun on the turret. The M-103 arrived at a time when the commander of the US 7th Army in Europe wanted a heavy tank to back up his new M48 medium tanks. He felt that it would be desirable to have the M-103 in Europe to overwatch the M48 tanks and that the tests should determine whether the vehicle was capable of playing that role as well as whether it possessed adequate reliability in retrograde operations, Hicks writes. That last point is particularly interesting, because the Germans had found that while they didn't lose many heavy tanks in combat, they abandoned a lot more during retreats. Towing a broken-down 70-ton King Tiger from the battlefield was no easy task. Faced with the prospect of an overwhelming Soviet armored assault, the 7th Army had every reason to want a heavy tank that could survive a retreat as well as an advance. Nonetheless, the M-103 still suffered from traditional heavy tank problems. In Europe it was found that the engine was underpowered, requiring replacement of engines and transmissions after average mileage distances of only about 500, Hicks writes. The ammunition stowage was not convenient, repeated firing of ammunition caused excess chamber erosion, tracks were easily thrown. Crew safety, comfort and ability to function were impaired by poor interior arrangement, and the same compensating idler defect encountered on the M48 tanks was found to exist in this one. But even with its flaws, the M-103 was still useful. Although it was felt that the tank was sluggish, it could do the job intended, Hicks writes. The Army received 74 M-103s. Enough to equip a single battalion, the 2nd Heavy Tank Battalion, 33rd Armor, in Europe. During the service in Europe, The heavy gun tanks were well liked by their crews, and they proved to be capable of being used in almost any place that the M48 series of medium tanks could be employed, according to Honeycust. The troops recognized that the powerful 120mm gun was far superior in penetration performance over the 90mm cannon of the medium tanks. Ironically, while the M-103 was an Army design, it was the Marine Corps that ended up with most of them. The Marines received 220 M-103A1s, plus the Army's vehicles in 1963. The Marine M-103 was supposed to be an interim solution until the MBT-70 tank arrived. But when the MBT-70 was cancelled, and rather than take the Army's M60 tank, the Marines added M60 components 5 to the M103. The resulting M103A2 had a higher speed than the base model, and a range of 300 miles. Finally, in 1972 the Marines retired the M103 and ended up with the M60. And that was the end of America's heavy tank experiment. What doomed it was the same issue that has eliminated heavy tanks around the world.